The last cool season turf grass that we'll talk about is what is called broadleaf or tall fescue. We mostly call it tall fescue in North America, but other folks may call it broadleaf fescue. I have question marks here for the genus because there's a great deal of controversy surrounding the use of Festuca or Shedinoris as the genus name for tall fescue. It's thought that about 2.8 million years ago, Shedinoris diverged from Lolium, and in fact, tall fescue can be hybridized with Lolium species like perennial ryegrass or annual ryegrass, which gives credence to the fact that these things are very closely related. But there's also evidence that tall fescue diverged from Festuca, and that occurred somewhere about 15 million years ago. So depending on which one of these two you buy into or you fall into philosophically, you would either call this Shedinoris or Festuca for tall fescues as the genus name. Regardless, the primary center of origin was believed to be warm, dry climates in Eurasia, European environments, kind of the area from Italy around to Turkey, Afghanistan, those areas, the Caucasus. This is where the most diversity in the broadleaf fescues and the tall fescues. Then it's believed that migration occurred both to Asia as well as to Africa, and in fact some of our best sources of germplasm in modern days derive from areas like Morocco and Libya and Egypt. So it's interesting that these areas, warm, dry climates, was where the tall fescues derived from. Also interesting is that because they produce, or they do best in warm, drier climates, there's not a lot of freezing tolerance. So we don't tend to find tall fescues growing in areas where there's a lot of freezing occurring over the course of winters. So climates like Tennessee, Kentucky, are where these grasses are best adapted in the U.S. If we get far north into Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, these grasses don't tend to do as well in these areas because of a lack of freezing tolerance. This has changed somewhat as we bred these grasses for turf grass type characteristics, but still freezing tolerance is a weakness to the adaptation of tall fescues. It's not likely, because of this lack of freezing tolerance, that there were migrations of tall fescue to North America. So it's likely an introduced species probably came over with the Europeans during settling of the colonies and was moved here for forage for their livestock. For me, and for the purposes of our class, I tend to lean towards the Festuca genus name, and so therefore tall fescue we would call Festuca arundinacea, and that's the species and the genus and species name for tall fescue for us. However, you will also see it referred to as Shedinoris arundinacea, as well as a debate between Shedinoris arundinacea and Shedinoris phoenix. But those are not very widespread in use in the literature, on the internet, etc. So we're going to stick with Festuca arundinacea for now, and at some time later, if the botanists decide what genus to officially put it in, and it ends up in Shedinoris, then we'll start working on that at that point. So these are the cool season grasses that we use as turf grasses, and as we've discussed, most of these kind of came from that temperate, warm climate of the Eurasian continent, Europe, basically around the Mediterranean and a little farther north, with moderate temperatures, not terribly warm days, some dry, some moist, depending on the species, but for the most part, the European climate is where most of these grasses developed, although there's a lot of evidence to suggest that those migrations took place over geologic time, and that those grasses in most of these areas could be reasonably believed to be native or well established long prior to the landing on the East Coast by European settlers. So that's the cool season grass.